Daniel, the book of Daniel this evening. Imagine that we are in a sort of a plaza doing our normal day-to-day things. The kids are playing because that's what they normally do. The adults are busy doing their work. The ladies are doing their work. The baker, the smiths, the pharmacists doing their regular work. And suddenly we hear an ominous sound. Horses galloping. And it becomes nearer and nearer and louder and louder. "Gather the kids," somebody yelled. "Call 911. No, they didn't have 911 back then. "Lock the gates," a soldier commands, but it's too late. The Babylonian horde is here. Read with me verses 1 through 10 in this introduction to the book of Daniel this evening. "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, that is, the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning, in knowledge and understanding, science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the princes of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. Thus far is the reading of God's word. And may this be a blessing in our hearing this evening. Tonight, before we go to our prayer time, I'd like to start to demonstrate for you from the study of Daniel this. Hear me now. Very, very important words. We can live godly lives in precarious times. We, as the people of God, can live godly lives in such a precarious world. I want you to notice on your outline this evening, number one, notice the siege. S-I-E-G-E, siege, verses 1 and 2. Now, in secular history, this invasion, this besieging that we read tonight by the Babylonian horde began to take place in the year 605 BC. Babylonian documents record that Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish in late spring of 605 BC and quickly subdued northern Syria. If you look at a map today, you will find the map of Palestine on the top of that Palestine where Israel is. You see Syria on the top, on the north. And then here's the Palestine. On this side is the Mediterranean Sea. You go down further, past the Sinai Peninsula, you'll find what? What big country down there? By the Nile Delta. Egypt. Now, what happened here in 605 BC is Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon, from this side, modern-day Iraq, goes over to Syria, north of Israel, to fight against the Egyptians. Now, how did the Egyptians get up there to the north? Well, they went up from the south to the north to be allied with the Syrian country. And along with that, as they have come up from the south, they pass through what? Israel. And around this time, Jehoiakim made allies with the Egyptian country as well as the Syrian country. And so when the Babylonians came to attack Syria at Carchemish, the Egyptian army were already there, but the Babylonians ended up defeating the Egyptians, the Syrians, and by this time also the Israelite people. Immediate threats against Egyptian allies such as Judah's king Jehoiakim would be expected, and the Babylonian priest historian Berosus reported that Nebuchadnezzar took Jewish captives in his 605 BC campaign. That is listed by the historian Josephus. So I've already explained to you that Carchemish is located in Syria. The Egyptians went all the way up there to be allied with Syria as well as Palestine, where Israel is located. And so when Syria fell to the Babylonians, Israel was ransacked as well. I want you to look at verse number 2, and I want you to see for yourself the major theme of the entire book of Daniel. The major theme for the entire book of Daniel comes out of these three words. What is that, class? And the Lord gave. The Lord gave. Okay? The Lord gave. Wait a minute. What is going on here? The Lord gave who? The Lord gave who to whom? The Lord gave who to whom for what? You mean to say, Pastor Christian, that it was God's will to bring about this siege to His own people? You mean to say that it was God's idea that the Babylonians plunder and murder their way through Palestine? At least it was God allowing them to do so. What does the verse say? The Lord gave. This is the theme. The Lord gave. Why? Because He is sovereign. He is ruler. He is king. Nebuchadnezzar might have thought that he was king. Jehoiakim might have thought that he was king. The Pharaoh of Egypt might have thought that he was king. But there is a king over all these kings. And who is it? None other than the Lord Jehovah God. He is king. He is sovereign. He rules the kingdoms of this earth. He rules the entire universe, and nothing and no one can overpower him. Now, class, what other expressions do we have other than the $1 million word sovereign? We always say what? That God is always in, what's that? Control. This is what it means. The sovereignty of God talks about His absolute control. How else do we put it? We put it this way: God is on His throne. That's what sovereignty means. I want you to look at chapter 4, verse 17. Chapter 4 of Daniel. The context here is Nebuchadnezzar's bad nightmare. Have you ever had a bad horse? Just kidding. A bad nightmare? Nebuchadnezzar saw a huge tree in his dream, and it was hewed down and cut to the stump. And then a magnificent creature from heaven told him in his dream. Look at verses 16 and 17. Let his heart, whose heart? Nebuchadnezzar's heart, be changed from a man's to what? And let a beast's heart be given unto him. What does that mean? That he is going to act like a beast. And let 7 times pass over him. What does that mean? 7 times, 7 years. Verse 17. This matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may what? Know that the Most High, what's the next word there, class? Rules in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. Who is the Most High? God is the Most High. What does He do? He rules in the kingdom of men. What else does He do? He gives the kingdom or the control of governments to whom? To whomever He wills. Look at verses 25 and 32 as well. Daniel 4:25, that they shall drive thee from men. This is now Daniel accurately interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's nightmare. Verse 25, that they should drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee till thou know that the Most High, what? Ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever He will. I want you to jump to verse number 32. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, meaning his nightmare became true. And he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. Wow. If you're looking for a book recommendation for the new year, then you ought to get a book entitled Trusting God When Life Hurts by Jerry Bridges. Let me tell you a little bit background of this book. Jerry Bridges, during a time of affliction, great trial in his life, great adversity, he began to look at the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And he did a thorough, systematic study from Genesis to Revelation, looking up the word for ruler, for God who is in control, God, the sovereignty of God, and God being on His throne. He did all of that, and it changed his life. And he shares the experiences and the things that he's learned from that study and wrote a book, Trusting God, Even Though When Life Hurts. Oh, I encourage you to get a copy of that. Then he says there that when you get a grasp at this, you will begin to trust God more, even when life hurts. This is the theme of the entire book of Daniel, that God is over all the universe, the ruler over all the universe. By the way, when we say universe, what does that include? It includes everything, does it not? It includes everything that you can see, as well as everything that you and I cannot see. Do you mean the virus and germs and bacteria, Pastor Christian? Absolutely. God is in control of everything. And this is the whole theme of the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel covers the historical events in the world from 605 BC until 530 BC. That is about 75 years of world human history. But the prophecies in it cover way beyond 75 years. In fact, when you get to chapter 7, all the way to chapter 12, it goes way beyond the span of 75 years. Why? Because God has given Daniel a glimpse of His view, of God's view, of world empires, of Babylon, Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the Roman Empire, and all the way to our present time today, and beyond that, even to the rapture, to the Great Tribulation, and onto the 1,000-year reign of King Jesus. God is sovereign over all of that. On your outline, number 2, we notice the selected in verses 3 through 7. The selected, verses 3 through 7. One of the great criticisms that are hurled against the historicity of the book of Daniel is that no one could ever find the name Ashpenaz in the records of Babylonian history. Well, I'll have you know tonight that as of the late 20th century, an inscription saying, it's almost word for word here, that says Ashpenaz, look at verse number 3, Ashpenaz, master of the eunuchs in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. That inscription can be found today in the British Museum. Squashed that great criticism, didn't it? The select men were to have, what does it say? No blemish. What does that mean? That means that they should not have any physical defect. They were to be well-favored. What does that mean? They were to be handsome-looking young men. Before I left for church tonight, I turned to my girls who were eating dinner, and I said, "How do I look?" And they said, "Handsome, Daddy. handsome. I am well favored. Praise the Lord. They were selected, and they had to be well favored. They were to be skillful in all wisdom, well versed in all kinds of wisdom. They were to be cunning in knowledge and understanding science, well educated, that is, and to have a keen insight. They were to have the ability to stand in the king's palace. That doesn't mean strong legs, but the capability of entering the king's royal service. And they were to be taught. What does it say here? The learning. What does that mean? That's the literature. The literature, and I would suppose the culture. And the tongue. What is the tongue? We learned a couple Sundays ago that tongue is what? Gibberish? No, it's a language. They were supposed to learn the tongue, the language of the Chaldeans. These men were selected, and their names are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, more popularly known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel's name is still popular because he wrote this book, and he used that book almost throughout the entire book, but he was given the name Belteshazzar as well. One of the very first things, listen now, this is a great statement. I want you to write it down if you can. One of the very first things that the enemies of Christ will do to you or have done to us is to brainwash you into thinking that your identity is not really in Jesus Christ. By what? By giving you a name that is contrary to your belief. A name that coincides with the enemy's philosophies. Now, that's a long statement, Pastor Christian. Can you repeat that again? Just write this down. One of the first things that the enemy will do to you is to rename you. Now listen now. Azariah means, the Lord is my help. No, they didn't want you to keep thinking that, so they gave him the name Abednego, which means you are a servant of Nebo, one of the Babylonian gods. Mishael means who is as God. No, again, they didn't want you to keep thinking about your God, so they gave him his name Meshach, which means who is like Aku, another of the Babylonians' gods, the moon god. Hananiah means beloved of the Lord. No, they didn't want him to keep thinking about the God of the Hebrews. So they gave him the name Shadrach, which means illuminated by the sun, probably an emphasis of the sun god. You see, my friends, the enemies of the people of God, even today, will start right here. And what do you do? What do they do? They'll attack your identity. They'll try to rename you. They'll try to redefine your identity. They'll start calling you the opposite of what you are, the opposite of who you are. They'll start renaming the good that you are to be in a bad light. They'll tell you you're on the wrong side of history, buddy. Get with it. They'll start renaming the good things that you do and twist it to be bad. You love marriage? We'll call you oppressive of women. You love the sanctity of life, and therefore you are a pro-life person? We'll say that you have a great disregard for women's choice, and you are against privacy. You are against reproductive health. You love the Bible? We'll call you anti-science. You love the traditional family structure where the husband is the spiritual leader of the family, will call you misogynistic and racist and sexist. That's the tactic of the enemy. And you've been warned. Are you listening? They did this back thousands of years ago to these young boys. They are doing it again even now. Rename, redefine, re-identify you. The selected ones were being brainwashed, re-educated, retrained to become the opposite of their identities, to be just like them, the Babylonians, to be immersed and to be saturated in their literature, in their culture, in their language, probably also in the manner that they talk. Pastor Christian, what did they do? How did they respond? How in the world should we behave if we're put in that position? Well, I'm glad you asked the question. Look at number 3 on your outline. Number 3, notice the separation. Verses 8 through 10. Daniel separated himself. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego separated themselves. What do I mean by that? We'll talk about that a little bit later. It is predominantly thought by the Bible students, Bible scholars, that Daniel and the other boys mentioned here were about 17 years of age, if not a little bit younger than that, during this captivity. This makes sense because that would put Daniel around 90 years of age when he died. All the boys, but mainly Daniel, who seemed to emerge as the leader of the pack, realized their most precarious situation. What did they do? How did they respond? How in the world should we then behave in a time like this? A dangerous time, a precarious time, troublesome time in which we live. Let me give you a couple of ideas here. First, I want you to notice that they were prepped up by the Babylonians to be what the Babylonians wanted them to be. But here's the thing. They realized that it was the sovereign God, after all, who was prepping them up. You get that? While Melzar and Ashpenaz, the eunuchs and the prince of the eunuchs, were the ones prepping them up to be used by the Babylonian Empire, behind all that, they realized that it was God actually prepping them up to be what God wanted them to be. Look at these verses again in verse number 2. And the Lord, what class? Gave. Look at verse number 9. Now who? God had brought. Now I want you to look at number 17. As for these 4 children, who? God gave them knowledge, etc., etc. It appeared that Ashpenaz was the one choosing them, yes, but ultimately, unseen by any of their enemies, God was the one choosing them. Oh, I want to leave you a couple of verses that come to mind when we think about this idea of the sovereignty of God. You remember Joseph? He was about 13 years of age. Poor Joseph, what happened to him? He had 11 brothers, 1 sister, and they just bullied him, right? He had a dream. He shared his dream. They didn't like that. And so what did they end up doing to him? They pushed him into a dry well. And he ends up in the bottom of that empty well. which landed him into slavery, in the house of Potiphar, which landed him into the prison by a false sexual allegation, which ultimately landed him onto the place of Pharaoh, the palace, who then made him to be the prime minister of the land. I'm going really fast with this background because I think you're a little bit familiar with this already. Let me ask you this. Who were the agents of his misfortunes? Who were the agents of his mistreatments? His brothers, right? They were men. But look at this. In Genesis, write it down. Genesis 50, verse 20. Amazing. Amazing statement that he made. His brothers were mean to him. They were a bunch of bullies. But in the most wonderful twist of events, they ended up going to Joseph and getting on their knees, their faces prostrated to the ground, and all of them profusely asked for forgiveness. They didn't even know at that time it was, or they knew already that this was Joseph. And so now, look at Joseph, how he responded. And this gives us a beautiful principle to apply for our day today. Genesis 50, verse 19. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? And verse number 20. But as for you, the agents of my maltreatment, the agents of my misfortunes, ye thought evil against me. But look at his expression. But God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Men are agents of evil, but God overrules all of them. Men and women might be able to do evil to you, but God can use that to His glory and for your good. Isn't it amazing? This is why the Apostle Paul is able to say in the New Testament what? And we know that all things work together for what? For good. To whom? To those who love God. And to those who are the called according to His purpose. Do you love God? Are you the called of God? This is the great promise that you have. If you don't love God and you are not the called of God, this promise is not for you. Men are agents of evil, but God supersedes all of that. God overrules all of that. Lastly, tonight, I want you to notice Daniel's purpose. What did he determine? What firm decision did he make? Why did he make such a determination? What would happen to him? What would happen to others who sided with him? Did Daniel see a bigger purpose than his own purpose? Did Daniel see a bigger purpose than Ashpenaz's purpose? Did Daniel see a bigger purpose than the Babylonians' purpose? Well, come back next time. We'll find out. All right?